So today I'm going to answer this one question which has been on every chess player's minds for centuries. Which piece is better, the bishop or the knight? Well, in today's video I'm going to tell you exactly that and more. So stay tuned and let's find out. Okay, welcome back. So in this video, what I'm going to do is show you 3 different examples which highlight 3 different concepts I want you to keep in mind when comparing your knights and bishops during a game. So the first concept will be piece quality, which is simply how effective your piece is compared to your opponent's. So when it comes to comparing knights, knights love squares, specifically outpost squares and weakened squares, which are simply squares which can't easily be attacked by your opponent's pawns. So here the 2 best squares would be e5 and c5, since they're the most centralized. You also want to put pawns on dark squares here, as well as your knight on a dark square, since they can't easily be attacked by your opponent's bishop on g2. What about the bishop on g2? Well, the bishop on g2 wants to be on open diagonals. Here, with the pawn on d5 blocking it, it's not as effective. If we take the pawn off the board, then the bishop would have a really nice square on d5 to go to, where it's a lot more effective. So here with black to move, we can see that white is planning to play the move a3, b4 to kick our knight away. So we want to secure the knight on c5 for longer. So we can start with the move rook to e3, putting pressure on the b3 pawn. Also preparing knight to d3. White played rook f1. And here black plays the move queen to e7, threatening to bring the rook to the 7th rank. Rook f2 is played, but this allows black to play the move queen to e5, hitting the g3 pawn, which can't easily be defended. Also notice how black is playing with all the pieces on the black squares, making the light square bishop effectively useless. Rook to f3 was played. Black played the move rook to e2, taking control over the 7th rank. Queen to b1 was played. Knight e4, threatening a family fork on d2. Rook e1, but this allows black to play the move knight to d2, hitting the queen and rook and winning some material. The game continued rook takes, queen d3, but now the knight simply takes the rook on f3. And after the exchanges, black is 1 full exchange up and went on to win comfortably. So we can see from this example that the knight was a bit more effective than the bishop, since the bishop had no open diagonals to go to. So here I've gone through and edited the position slightly for both sides, just to show you how much things can change with a slight change in pawn structure. So we can see that here the knight doesn't have the squares on e5 and c5 to go to anymore, which limits its scope a little bit. And also, since there's no pawn on d5, this bishop on g2 is an absolute monster, breathing down this whole diagonal here. Also, we see this potential pass c pawn, which is available for white, and white can play the move pawn to c5 straight away, creating a pass pawn. Bishops are excellent pieces for defending and supporting pass pawns, since they can do so from a very safe distance away. Here already white has a very strong initiative, and it's very hard to stop the pass pawn. For example, rook c8, we could play c6, let's say knight f6. White can further support the pawn with his pieces and kick the queen away next with the move rook b1 to b7 and keep marching the pawn up the board. We see this bishop on g2 is not just an excellent defensive piece, it's also an excellent attacking piece by supporting the pawn on c6 square. And this is really when the bishop excels over the knight. Okay, so let's move on to our second example for now. So now let's take a look at the second example we have here. So this is all going to be about pawn structure and specifically open and closed positions. When it comes to knights, knights prefer to be in closed off positions where they have lots of squares and options to maneuver, whereas the bishops want long open diagonals. Therefore, the bishops want to be as open as possible here. In this following situation here, the pawns are relatively closed off on the king side as well as the queen side, which heavily favors the two knights. We see white's last move was bishop to f2. He wants to bring the bishop to h4 and possibly put pressure along these weakened dark squares which black has on the king side. However, black's next move is really strong. Black plays the move knight to h5, putting pressure on the f4 pawn. We see that white's two pieces here, the queen and bishop, are already tied down to defending the c4 pawn. And the only way to defend this pawn in f4 is to either defend it with the dark squared bishop or defend it with the g3 pawn. So if white plays the move pawn to g3, he weakens squares on the king side. Always make sure that you take advantage of squares left behind, especially when you make pawn moves, because every time you make a pawn move, you can't move it back. So here, to take advantage of the weakened light squares on the king side white just created, we can switch along to this long diagonal. So we can play a move such as queen to e8, and let's say knight to e3, queen c6, and already we're threatening bishop to b7 and deadly checkmates along this open diagonal. If instead white plays the move bishop to g3 or bishop to e3, as he did in the game, we can see that the bishop is completely out of play. So these two bishops are really bad pieces at the moment, doing nothing but defending white's weakened pawns. White continues to attack the weaknesses now and put even more pressure by playing the move queen to e8. We see all these weaknesses on the queen side, so black switches the queen to the queen side. Knight e3, queen a4, putting heaps of pressure and really nullifying white's two bishop advantage here, using the power of the pawn structure to limit white's scope and also just applying a lot of pressure on white's weaknesses. White had to play the move queen to a2, but already we see white's pieces are extremely passive and black went on to win a very nice game. So in the next example, we'll have a look at what happens when the bishops do get an open board and aren't limited by the pawn structure, just how scary and how effective they can become. Okay, so for the third example I've chosen is a game played by William Steinitz, the first world champion, with the black pieces here. Black played the move knight to c4, attacking and putting pressure on the bishop on e3, provoking white to give up the bishop pair, which white does. Black takes back, getting the bishop pair. White plays the move queen to f2, and now the most important thing when it comes to playing with the bishop pair is to firstly hit that like button for the YouTube algorithm, and the next thing is to put the bishops on open diagonals, as I mentioned before. When it comes to the two bishops, what you want to do is make sure that you utilize the bishop your opponent does not have, and in this situation, the bishop your opponent does not have is the light squared bishop. So this is going to be the problem piece for white in this position here. What we want to do is kick the knight out first with the move pawn to c5, since the bishop is eyeing the b7 square. The knight goes back and we play the move pawn to b6, threatening to play the move bishop to b7. We also put our pawns on black squares, which restrict white's existing dark squared bishop and also stops white from exchanging off the important dark squared bishop, which would neutralize some of our two bishop advantage. White played knight to e5, the queen drops back, queen across, bishop to a6 was played, f6. So it's very important when your opponent has potentially threatening pieces to just simply get rid of them. Here we need to get rid of the knight. Even though we temporarily block our bishop, it doesn't really matter. What we want to do is limit our opponent's pieces and their scope. h5, again black is putting pressure on this knight in g4, forcing it to some really awkward squares. We're weakening our king side a little bit, but it doesn't really matter. The knight goes to f2, the queen goes to f7. This is a really nice sidestep, potentially threatening to bring the bishop back to b7 onto this big diagonal which we want the bishop on. White plays the move pawn to f5, which makes sense. So white wants to open up his bishop and bring the bishop into the game. Black doesn't want to create any weaknesses, so it plays the move pawn to g5 to keep our pawn structure intact, also keeping this bishop locked out of the game. Rook to d1, bishop to b7 was played. So we have this weakness on e6, but it's okay since we have the light squared bishop to cover it. And also white's pieces are particularly not effective in this position. Queen to g3, rook to d5. Black wants to double rooks on the open d file and put pressure on the f pawn here. Takes, rook d1. Already white is forced to sacrifice this pawn. He could have tried to defend it, but I think it would eventually drop anyway. Black happily takes it, at the same time preventing the rook from going to the d7 square. So queen c7 was played by white. Bishop d5, very good move to stop the rook and cutting it off from entering the 7th rank. Pawn to b3. Here black played the move rook to e8. You always want to utilize free tempos given to you, and also to bring your pieces to open and semi-open files. Pawn goes to c4. Bishop goes back to f7. So here we see black has already managed to win a pawn, so black goes back to just defend and consolidate his king side. With this 3 vs 2 pawn mass on the king side, black can also just push these pawns up the board slowly in a bit. The rook enters the game on e2 square, threatening queen takes f2 as well as rook takes a2. The rook goes back into a more passive position, so now we can start attacking even more by playing queen c2. Queen g3 was played, and Steinitz takes some time out to just take the pawn on a2, since white has no threats at all. Queen to b8, king h7, queen back, bishop g6. So we see that even though this bishop on g7 is somewhat of a bad piece, it doesn't really matter because it has the potential to always come into the game whenever it wants. And at the same time, our light squared bishop this whole game has just been doing a great job of limiting the scope of white's knight here on f2. h4 was played, g4 was played. The knight again doesn't have too many squares to go to. Plays knight to b3, but here this allows black to take the pawn on b3. So we take this, and after queen c7, black just captures the knight on d3 and is a whole piece up. So white resigned. So we can see in this game, basically what was the problem for white this whole game was this knight. It never really came into the game, and also this dark squared bishop was limited by our pawns. So the 2 minor pieces never played an important role, whereas black's 2 bishops, as well in particular the light squared bishop, was highly effective. To conclude this video and answer this question, you can see that it varies a lot depending on the pawn structure and the situation we're in. Knights are really effective at the lower levels, I find, when they can be so annoying of a piece to deal with. However, if I were to choose, then I would probably choose the bishop the majority of the time, if you know what I mean.